Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Bernstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
And Dave, we have a special guest, but before we get to him, you're gonna tell us a little bit about what we're gonna talk about later.
The second half of the show is going to talk about people who had spinal injuries, were in a wheelchair, and now can walk. Because the techniques that are being developed for AI can actually read minds enough to figure out a signal of what you want your legs to do. And then they just hook it up to an actuator and turn you into a robot moving your legs.
Wow. Now that's some fascinating stuff. I'm looking forward to that. But
Yeah,
before
but
we
that's
get to that,
the show.
let me introduce our guest. We have David Siffert, who is the legal director for STOP, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project here in New York City. David, welcome to Community Technology.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we've had a few folks from your operation on. You guys do such incredible work. I was at a hearing about 3 weeks ago, and with the technology committee of the city council, and the hearing was about some biometric legislation, biometric surveillance legislation that was pending in New York City. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, what's going on. I found it kind of fascinating. What is that?
Absolutely. So I think Dave's introduction about the second half can show how technology can have really positive benefits. I think that the fact that we're all talking here and people can hear us, even though we're all in different places, is another example of technology having positive benefits. But technology is a tool, just like any other tool, and it can also be harmful. And it's important for the government to step up and regulate technology so it can be used in a way that helps people, but doesn't cause all sorts of harm. Now, there's a technology that's on the rise called facial recognition technology. What this technology does is it allows people to grab a photo or video image of someone and match that photo or video to a database of images that are associated with names, and then figure out who you are. And there are all sorts of ways this can be problematic. It can be problematic if it works. For example, Madison Square Garden using this technology to prevent lawyers engaged in lawsuits against them from attending events at Madison Square Garden owned facilities as a way of trying to basically engage in illegal activities without facing legal ramifications because lawyers aren't going to want to go up against them. And it's also potentially even more harmful when it doesn't work. For example, when people are wrongly arrested for crimes they didn't commit because of a facial recognition mismatch. And what's particularly pernicious here is that facial recognition technology is quite inaccurate in general, but especially inaccurate if you aren't white, especially the darker your skin, the less accurate it is. It's inaccurate if you're gender nonconforming. It's less accurate for women than for men. So, for example, a Black woman, the machine might be 100 times more likely to make a mistake than for a white man. This has led to people actually being wrongly arrested in ways that are quite terrifying. There was a man recently wrongly arrested in Atlanta and kept for 2 days in jail for a crime in Louisiana due to a facial recognition hit. And this is someone who'd never even been to Louisiana. So the way these databases are connected all across the country make it particularly dangerous. So the bills that were introduced, there are 2 bills out of what we would like to have as a 3-bill package. So the first bill that was introduced bans facial recognition use in public accommodations and biometric identification processes in public accommodations as a whole. So this would also include, fingerprinting, iris scans, and the like. So this would stop, for example, what Madison Square Garden is doing. Another bill bans the use of biometric identification in housing by landlords for tenants and for their guests. You could imagine this technology being used, for example, to exclude people from their own homes or guests from people's homes, and especially dangerous given how racially biased it is, you could imagine that New Yorkers of color will wind up excluded from their own homes, and their guests won't be able to get into their homes, and police could even wind up being called due to a mismatched facial recognition identification.
Wow.
Now, the third bill that we would really like is a government use ban of biometrics. We don't think that police should be using this technology for the reasons I just described, people getting wrongly arrested. Now, the council has not yet introduced that bill, despite our urging. And so we would very much like to see the council introduce that bill as well, so that we could have 3 sort of compatible bills that we could push together.
Mm-hmm. But these are all New York City bills, correct, David?
Correct. This is all in New York City. There are some bills in the state legislature as well that would regulate biometrics. In fact, there's one on government use, there's one on residential use, there's one on public accommodations use. Actually, there's 2 on government use. One's a moratorium and one's a ban. But the ones that we just had the hearing on in the city council, and the ones that have some traction right now, are all in the city council.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you this, David. I was at that last hearing, and I actually sat on a panel with 3 folks who were involved in retail sales, and they were like really adamant about the need for surveillance to deal with the shoplifting phenomenon. And I got educated to some degree. I'm kind of old school. I thought shoplifters were folks that were poor and needed supplies, needed food or whatever. And not that is not the case, but apparently there's been a huge development of a shoplifting industry, if you will, where folks are hired to go shoplift, and there's a whole collection of goods and produce that are then resold. So it's a criminal industry apparently, and fairly significant in size. And the retailers that were at the hearing were really, I don't know the details of the legislation, but they were opposing the legislation on the grounds that it would prohibit them from being able to protect their retail establishments. Can you talk a little bit about some of the issues there?
Sure. I'll say a few things. Shoplifting is not a new phenomenon, and organized shoplifting is also not a new phenomenon. And it is a real problem, and there are people who have small businesses who are losing income as a result. The issue is severalfold. One is the extent to which this is a new phenomenon or a growing phenomenon has been largely exaggerated by the tabloids. This is something that people have always dealt with. The second is that this technology right now is not super widespread, and a lot of the people that are saying that they need this technology, don't even use this technology. The third is that this technology has largely not been successful at doing this, which is to say that as it's been adopted, we haven't seen drops in shoplifting. In fact, the same people that are saying they need what they've added have been saying that shoplifting has been going up. And even more specifically, none of the people of the council were able to testify about a single specific example of their being able to stop shoplifting as a result of this technology. So it actually isn't solving the problem. And the last thing I want to say is this. I think a lot of us are familiar with stores excluding people of color just on the basis of their race, or following people of color around the stores because they're worried they're shoplifters. This is a digitized version of that. This technology is largely inaccurate with respect to people of color, and you will start to see people of color flagged by these systems, excluded from stores essentially because of their race, followed around stores essentially because of their race, potentially have police called on them, and potentially winding up in violent situations even though they haven't done anything wrong. And so even if the industry were able to come up with an example where they stopped shoplifting because facial recognition match went off and they were able to get the person away, and in fact it was accurate, if they came up with 1 or 2 of these, maybe that'll happen. But for every 1 or 2 of those, there'll be people who are wrongly being excluded, who are wrongly being followed around stores. And that's not the country that we've collectively decided we want to live in. We have laws that ban this kind of discrimination. And the fact that you've automated it and digitized this kind of discrimination doesn't all of a sudden make it okay. So Our position is this technology should not be used for that purpose. If you have a picture of a shoplifter and you keep them in your store and don't let them come back in, that's legal. This doesn't change that. But these automated, inaccurate, and racially biased systems shouldn't be used for that purpose.
Wow. Yeah, sounds like a digital Jim Crow.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Hey, Dave B, you had a question you wanted to weigh in on? Yeah, you're muted, Dave.
He came up with the whole point that the evidence of big increase in shoplifting is pure garbage, at least in San Francisco, where it's been a big issue, and the newspapers looked into it. It's not happening. It's just an excuse for the stores to do what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
There hasn't been a huge increase in shoplifting in the United States, period.
Wow.
Yeah.
If you track, there's a great report by a group called Forward, which did a report on New York's bail reform. And one amazing thing they showed was how crime increased versus how reporting on crime increased. And the extent of news stories that increased about crime was just totally out of scale with actual changes in crime. And so a lot of the fear that we're hearing is really media manufactured.
Wow, now that I find that very interesting, David. I mean, because the media and politicians use fear to manipulate us to such a degree, at least this is my opinion, that they use that to manipulate people, to manipulate voting, to manipulate how folks who gets elected, and that's amazing to hear. If you could offline send me that report, I would love to see that and maybe have a show really focused on that, how the reporting on crime is disproportionate to the actual commission of crime. And I find that fascinating and a dereliction of media responsibility from where I sit. I mean, it's just so irresponsible. So what else is going on, David, with STOP other than those three pieces of pending legislation in New York City? What else is noteworthy with what you guys are doing?
I guess there's two other things that are worth talking about. There's a bunch of things going on at the state level, I should say. Right now, we're about 2 weeks from the end of the year's session at the state legislature up in Albany. They end on June 9th, and they're trying to cram in as many bills as possible before then, sort of. And we have some bills that we think would be really important for the legislature to move that we've been pushing on. There are three especially that are sort of being talked about that we're seeing if we can get over the finish line. One is a ban on what's called geofence warrants. These are when the idea is police don't know who committed a crime, but they have a general idea of where and when it was committed. And so they issue a warrant on Google to turn over the geolocation data of everyone who is in that general area at that general time. The problem, of course, is that we have this thing called a Fourth Amendment, which says that if you're going to search someone, you need probable cause to think that that's going to turn over evidence of the crime when you search that individual person. Now, the police are saying, oh, we're searching Google. But what they're really doing is they're searching hundreds, if not thousands of people in every single one of these searches and creating this dragnet that gets them quite a substantial amount of sensitive information on quite a lot of people. These geofences could be put around a protest and have been. They could be put around an abortion clinic. They could be put around a place providing gender-affirming care. You could dragnet in the data of people who are undocumented. So there's all sorts of ways that this could be particularly harmful. And bring in people who haven't done anything wrong and get the police access to all sorts of data of people who haven't done anything wrong without any sort of probable cause even to think that they have.
Mm-hmm.
So
Dave, let me interrupt you for a second. The geofence data, what does it collect? It collects your cell phone, your cell phone IP address, or what is it actually collecting?
So there are all sorts of companies out there that store geolocation data on large numbers of people. Google is one predominant one that gets a lot of these warrants. In fact, this is the most common warrant Google gets. So they know for all of their customers where they've been and their whole geolocation history. And they store this in a database so that the police can say, we want to know, for who was at Yankee Stadium during the game, or who was at or near Yankee Stadium during the game. Something happened outside of the stadium. And so they say, Google, give us all that information. And so they'll say, we want to know everyone over the course of 12 hours who is near Yankee Stadium. And Google will provide all that data for all the people, like, where they were before, where they were after, how they moved over that period of time. So it could store, where they slept, where they worked, where they've been. This could include all sorts of different sensitive things that a person might have done during that time where they wouldn't want the police to know about, or anyone else to know about. And so it provides that geolocation information to the police. Now, they can also do something similar, which this also bans, which is called a reverse search warrant, meaning they can say, we want to know everyone who searched for this address. And they get the identities of everyone who searched for that address, or everyone who searched for abortion clinic near me, or gender affirming care, or any term that they want to search for. If they think that if they can get a warrant to say that anyone who searched for this, that might turn up evidence of a crime, they can issue that on Google and then issue these dragnets while pretending they're not searching all the different specific individuals. It's like saying, we think a crime happened in this neighborhood, so we're going to search everyone's house in this neighborhood. Clearly would be a constitutional violation, but because that data is being held by Google right now, courts are allowing these warrants to happen. So we are trying to ban those warrants.
Now, is that on state level that you're doing that?
State level, exactly, because suppression of evidence is something that New York City can't do because state has control of the courts. So this bill really has to happen at the state level.
Is there any other activity that you're aware of across the country to attack that problem?
Yes, absolutely. So we drafted this bill with the ACLU, and it's become a model to use all across the country. So this has now been introduced everywhere from California to Utah. It's gotten a hearing in Missouri. It was first in New York. We hope it passes in New York first, but it is now gaining traction all across the country.
Excellent. Now, is there likely or could there be federal legislation to attack that problem?
Absolutely, but you know how the federal legislature is right now. It's just not really doing anything. Now, there was federal litigation in Virginia that held these warrants to be unconstitutional, but it only worked for that particular case. So as a result, despite that the only case that reached it said that this is an unconstitutional procedure, we don't have like a Supreme Court decision on that, unfortunately. We think that if it ever did get there, it would be held unconstitutional. But in the meantime, the most common warrant Google gets is this kind of warrant. There are thousands of them every year.
Now, when Google gets those warrants, does it go before a judge, or is it just between law enforcement and Google?
The law enforcement goes to a judge, gets the judge to sign a warrant, and then
is exceptional. And one of the ways that people can attack is exceptional.
Go ahead, David. I don't know why.
Yeah, sure. No worries. Law enforcement goes to a judge, will get them to sign off on a warrant, and then they'll serve that warrant on Google and say, hey, you have to give us the data.
So judges are cooperating with this.
Judges have absolutely been cooperating.
Now, you said there's something else pending in the state as well, other than the geo-tracking legislation?
Yeah, there's a couple other good bills and one bad bill. So the other two good bills, one is a relatively straightforward bill. It's sort of a sanctuary state bill. It's called New York for All. This is being led by an organization called the New York Immigration Coalition. So this is the premier primary bill that would prevent New York law enforcement and other New York apparatuses of New York government for collaborating with ICE and other parts of the Department of Homeland Security to get people deported. So it's a relatively straightforward bill. Frankly, I'm not sure why there's even any controversy about its passing. I think it should be a no-brainer, but it's a fight. And the last one is a bill led by Legal Aid to ban unofficial DNA databases. So New York State has this official DNA database that's created by New York State law. There's rules about how data is collected, from whom, under what circumstances, how it's stored. All of that is created by New York State law. This is sort of inconvenient for the New York City Police Department, and they've created their own rogue database so that they don't have to comply with all these rules. And what they'll do is they'll take a kid, often as young as like 11 years old, keep them in interrogations all day. At the end, be like, here, have a glass of water. The kid takes the glass of water. They'll like take the saliva from the rim of the glass and they'll put it into a database and keep it there forever.
Whoa.
It's pretty scary. And it happens all the time. And they have this enormous database that's been collected we believe illegally because it's not complying with the state law to use the state database, but they do it all the time. And so there's this bill that would ban these rogue databases, wipe them and say, look, you have to comply with the law and just use the state database as the law says. And that's another bill that we're pushing to move through this year.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That sounds like an important piece of legislation. I had no idea that kind of police data collection is going on. That sounds so sneaky, underhanded. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, something else I read about on your site, that being the stop sign, banning Big Brother. What is that a campaign? What is that?
Yeah, banning Big Brother is a campaign. We have 10 bills in a package called Banning Big Brother that we're trying to push in the state legislature. I just mentioned 3 of them. There are 7 others that don't have, I would say at the moment, aren't going to pass this year. I'll put it that way. We only have 2 weeks left of session. There's not enough time to move all 10 of them. So these are the 3 we're hoping for. But there are plenty of other important bills out there that we really want to move. We want to ban police use of drones for law enforcement purposes. We want to ban cell site simulators. These are fake cell phone towers that police keep in vans and can bring out to a protest. And then people's cell phones will try to connect to them thinking that they're a tower. And so the police can harvest people's device IDs, figure out everyone who is at a protest, potentially intercept text messages from these people. So there's a number of other important bills that are included in this package, but those are just a couple examples of them.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, we're about the halfway point. Dave B, yeah, you want to chime in?
I was just going to remind you our guest needs to go.
Okay. Well,
I have one more thing I want to mention is I mentioned that there was a bad bill that's happening in Albany,
Yes.
and I think it's worth bringing up. There's a bill ironically entitled the New York Privacy Act. So California has passed quote unquote comprehensive privacy regulation. We know about this because whenever we go to a website, there's a pop-up that basically doesn't have much impact on our lives other than the pop-up itself. It has largely not been an effective way of protecting our privacy from big data brokers and big data in general. New York has moved forward with a bill that effectively mimics the California model of sort of opt out of data collection, data storage, data sharing in a very limited and largely ineffective way. This bill has mostly been negotiated between big tech and the legislature in order that they don't have to comply with higher standards that many are pushing in New York. New York Civil Liberties Union, for example, has worked with legislatures on a bill called the Digital Fairness Act. It would be a much more robust way of restricting big tech from collecting people's data. In order to block legislation like that, they've put this weaker bill in called the New York Privacy Act. And we're just hoping that the legislature doesn't do something foolish and move forward with it, despite the fact that sort of all the privacy advocates are opposed to it.
Wow. Well, that's some fascinating stuff. You guys are really to be congratulated for the work that you're doing, David. I certainly kudos to the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project for their diligence in keeping track of the stuff that's going on.
Thank you so much. It was really great chatting with you. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. We've been speaking with David Siffert, the legal director for STOP, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. David, thank you so much. And please, we'd love to have you back and keep us posted as you guys move forward with this stuff. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you. This is Community and Technology with Dave Bernstein and Stu Reed on WHCR 90.3 FM. We're going to take a brief musical break and be right back. Stay tuned. Okay, we're back. Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reed on WHCR 90.3 FM. We were talking earlier with legal director David Siffert at STOP, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. I'd advise our listeners to keep an eye out for all of the activity that's going on in New York State, New York City regarding surveillance legislation. Folks at STOP are really on top of it. But now we're going to switch gears. And Dave, you had a couple of items you wanted to talk about. What's up?
Well, I promised to start with one of the most incredible pictures. We can't show it to most of you because most of you are just getting this on the radio I've ever seen. It was a man walking. Why was it incredible? 11 years ago, he was in a motorcycle accident. He hasn't been able to walk since. He's walking normally now. This is the Times has the story. His name is Gert-Jan Oxum. The way this is happening is twofold. It's easy to understand how you could put a shell on somebody's legs and move it. They do that with a whole lot of robotics at this point. And they're working on that, of course, at every major military in the world, because you can have you can have a battery there that lets somebody carry more than a human being normally could. That's easy. The hard part is figuring out how the person can control it. And what the picture in the Times shows you is he's wearing a little headset. It is now possible to read somebody's mind well enough to tell that somebody's what to do.
Wait a minute. Am I hearing you right? You're saying that this technology can now read a person's mind and say, move my left leg, move my right leg, I want to walk, and the technology can read those thoughts and then activate the robotic devices?
Absolutely. It's not as simple as reading thoughts, and we don't have anything that can pick out words from his head, but you can train somebody to think about something, which activates a particular part of their mind, and use that as a signal to the person's leg. Real. Now, this technology it comes from two parts. First of all, how can you read the mind suddenly when you couldn't do that 5 years ago or 100 years ago? These EEGs go all the way back. And it turns out this is an application of artificial intelligence, not ChatGPT, that has the ability, just like ChatGPT can get all the information on the web, to listen to the signal from somebody's mind and pick out patterns. And you can train somebody to create a pattern that will be able to move their legs. There's Gert-Jan Oxum is in the Times talking about 12 years I've been trying to get back my feet. Now I have learned to walk normal, natural.
David, does he have to? I mean, what does he think? Is he thinking? Is he just walking like you and I were walking without even thinking, or does he have to think? I'm going to walk. I want to move my leg. I mean, what's the actual pattern of his thought wave? Do we know that? Did the story talk about that?
Yeah. He talks about they use an implant in this case for the brain, bypass the spinal cord that's injured, and he can stand, walk, ascend a steep ramp with only the assistance of a walker.
Wow.
It's been more than a year, and he has retained those abilities and actually achieved signs of neurological recovery, working with crutches, even when the implant was switched off.
Wow. So somehow the body is learning?
Well, we know the nerves can regenerate themselves. That was a big breakthrough about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's called neuroplasticity. Until then, they thought that if you had an injury to your head, That was it. There was
Right.
nothing we could do about it except train people to walk other ways. It turns out that, yes, the body, even in old folks, has the ability to regenerate nerves. It doesn't do it very quickly or very efficiently. We're not a little lizard that you can cut the tail off and grow another one. But it is working, and that's the kind of thing that is now possible. Remarkable. That's not the only medical example. Did I tell you about the lady I sat next to at dinner down in Washington a few years ago?
You mentioned it offline, but please share that story with our listeners.
Had a perfectly normal conversation with the lady sitting next to me, who for 60 years had been completely deaf. She got an implant, and we could talk to each other suddenly. That's working. And we've got examples of ways you can hook up right to the optic nerve, and for some people, allow the blind to see. This
You're saying
hasn't been.
restore vision, Dave? Is that what you just said? With technology?
Yep.
Wow.
Only certain cases, but there are some, and it's going to get better and better because the technology we have now has the ability to, one, sense something really, really faint and small, and two, find patterns in it. Another medical example that's just happened, a little bit different, is we all know about Prozac. It's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It works on the it's thought to work on the serotonin in your brain, and by raising the serotonin, it does often elevate people's moods. It doesn't work nearly as well as you'd hope, but it does help some. How does serotonin work? Where in the brain does it work? How does it connect to your neurons in the brain? Turns out there's 5 separate connectors in the neurons that have just been examined by a team at MIT who did the example in a little nematode worm. They use that as an example because there's very few neurons, and I guess they're larger than the human ones. We've got 1 billion neurons in our small skull, and they were able to find and track 5 different receptors, all of which had different effects, all of which were differently affected by the drugs that come into it. Next one. I saw some pictures this week that some people had made with their brain. Again, they're putting a head cap on.
Thoughts into a visual representation. That's what you're saying, Dave?
Yeah. Now, it's not something that I can take your face and regenerate it, but they are able to manage blocks of color, general appearances, shapes by thinking in a well-trained way and having the AI connected to their headset figure out what that pattern is. It is that powerful.
Wow.
This is all very welcome.
Now, one of the mundane uses that I just saw, I mean, I say mundane, but it's still pretty startling. iPhone now is using AI where they can, after 15 minutes of training, replicate your voice so that essentially you can leave messages and it synthesizes your voice and can talk like you. And you know, it sounds a little frightening, but then one of the things that gave me pause when I read the story, it said, you know, what the company is focusing on is people with cognitive, vision, and hearing mobility disabilities. So folks that have difficulty talking or expressing themselves verbally, this technology can record snippets of your voice, I guess, and then create sentences or whatever to help with your communication skills if you're disabled.
It's the same kind of technology, looking for patterns
Mm-hmm.
and finding those patterns, putting them to work.
Mm-hmm.
Text to speech has been there, and about 10 years ago, when they got neural networks working the way they need to, it started getting pretty good. That's where we're getting all the deep fakes. We've got people seeming to sound like Elon Musk, and the popular singer Grimes has decided to put her voice in the public domain.
Really?
Yep. She's recorded some stuff and says, take my voice, put it on my songs or put it on your songs or poems, and it will come out in my voice.
Whoa.
Now,
Wow.
what is this stuff? A Wall Street Journal reporter tried it out and managed to fool her own sister.
Mm-hmm.
There are miracles happening.
Mm-hmm.
There may be destructive things happening too, and we can talk about as much of that as we want to. In fact, yeah. Oh, I can't do it here. I'm going to do a book review next week
Mm-hmm.
on the makers of artificial intelligence, which has 23 interviews with the top people in the field. It's now 5 years old, but most of the big issues we're talking about, they were looking at, including, for example, the bias that's involved in a lot of the work there. Now, we had a guest here talking about how an innocent man was picked up and arrested and held in jail because of an error in AI. And he was talking about how AI doesn't do as good a job on people with darker skin. Well, 5 years ago, it turned out all the top AI people knew this, talked about it, had been working on it. And while I don't have any data on it, I bet that effect is significantly reduced compared to even a year or two ago. It's still real and it's still important. Did I tell in the story about how my Kodak film was racist?
I don't recall that, Dave. We got about 3-4 minutes left, so let's hear it.
Okay, this is a good one. Years ago, I was doing the computer work for a printer. We did a lot of scanning and so on. So I learned some color theory and how to do things like align our high-end scanner, $50,000 scanner. Really powerful. It's almost as good as the ones you can buy for $800 in the computer store today. But this was 25 years ago and it cost $50,000. It turns out that there was a standard calibration. It was a little card and it had gray scales and it had different colors and it had a picture of a blonde model. And that blonde model was used to set the standard face tone at Kodak. In fact, Kodak made the card.
Mm-hmm.
The net result was that if you were trying to work or trying to shoot somebody with any camera of the day, it did not do as good a job on people with darker skin as with people whose skin was like that model. And this was very deliberate. They talked about this as these are face tones, these are natural. And that was what you actually planned when you did the chemistry of Kodak and Fujitsu and the other films.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
I don't know if that was ever fixed. It has been fixed, mostly in the last year or two, with the cell phone cameras. Now your cell phone camera has heavy-duty processing, a kind of AI again, to try to get a better image. And one of the things that they've been able to do only in the last year or two is improve the image of people with dark skin, that it's more accurate. And that was a feature that I think it was Apple was showing off at a trade show a few months ago, how it does a decent job on people whose skin is dark. So it may be that when these AI robots come together, they may decide to do that they don't need people. I mean, remember what happened when Europe had the Neanderthals and the modern Homo sapiens. The Neanderthals were there, the Homo sapiens came out of Africa, and a few thousand years later.
Bye-bye
no
Neanderthals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we will see what happens, Dave. This is some fascinating stuff, especially this latest information that we were talking about with the implants and the reading of mind patterns to create body movements. I mean, it sounds so cyborg-like. Fast
Yeah, but
forward.
one of us could have throat cancer and a tracheotomy and not be able to talk afterwards.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you can type, you can get your own voice.
Wow.
And if you could bat your eyelashes, which is how Stephen Hawking communicated in the last years, you could hear his actual voice.
So much going on. This AI stuff is fascinating. Every week, Dave, there are more layers and more intricacies involved with what it can do, what it might do. So thanks, Dave. This has been Dave Bernstein and Stu Reed on Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Stay tuned every Wednesday, 5 p.m. You just might learn something. Thanks for checking us out. Good night.